You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming to you now from downtown Spokane live, it is Long Waves with Gary Krug. As always, I will announce at the top of the show that the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. And thank you for joining me today. Oh my goodness. It's been such an interesting week. Such an interesting week. You know, I was working up today's show and I was thinking about, well, all the things going on and what passes for the news in this country. And I've had a couple of people say to me, really, why are you not doing domestic politics? How come you don't talk about domestic politics? And I've given the same answer for quite a while. But I'll give the answer again. On a national level, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This dog and pony show, for a variety of reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But at the simplest level, there is the government of infrastructures, of bureaucracy, of military organization, of manufacturers of weapons, all of these bureaucrats who've found secure positions, these nice little GS jobs in the government. They don't change, and you don't vote for them. And they're the ones who are essentially running the system in a variety of ways. To use the idea of Sheldon Wolden, who just died this last October at the age of 93, which was sad. But Wolden had advanced the idea for a while that Wolin had advanced the idea for a while of an inverted totalitarianism, so that on the bottom everything looks normal. We don't see the totalitarians. I'll get it out in a minute. The totalitarian. I'm having trouble here. The totalitarianism on the level of the street. Rather, it exists at higher levels, in the dual state, in the dark state, in the state, the efficient state, the state that runs things, the prerogative state. And we don't get to vote on that one. The politicians we elect, can there be any doubt left after what Congress has become and after what the presidential election is shaping up to be, that this gives us an illusion of participation, an illusion of democracy? And the experience of living in such a world is the experience of Kafka, the characters of Kafka. Waking up and finding yourself a cockroach, living in a world where absolutely nothing makes sense, where it seems to make sense, but it doesn't. Like one of his little stories, Four Dame Gazettes, before the law, where every day the protagonist goes to the halls of justice, where he meets a big guard, and the guard says, "The law is not for you." And this repeats. Every day he goes there, every day the guard says, "The law is not for you." Until finally he goes to the Hall of Justice as he's dying, and is dying on the steps in front of it. And the big guard there says, "The law was always just for you." That's a bit what it's like living in this world. And I was starting to put the show together, and maybe it's autumn, I don't know. But I began to think of poems that resonated for me around this issue. And two came to mind. Well, actually three. One of them was, of course, William Butler Yeats' The Second Coming. But the other two I decided to go with. So I'm going to do one at the top of the show and one at the bottom of the show. And the first one is the poem Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? The issue is, as I said in the previous show, that these structures by which we make meaning of our world have altered, and they no longer reflect or convey or comment upon the realities of our world. So we have a language from another time and another set of situations that we keep trying to apply to our world as if it is real. But it's not. And in the place of reality are myths and ideologies. Quoting Sheldon Wolin on this point, when myth begins to govern decision makers in a world where ambiguity and stubborn facts abound, the result is a disconnect between the actors and the reality. They convince themselves that the forces of darkness possess weapons of mass destruction and nuclear capabilities, that their own nation is privileged by a God who inspired the Founding Fathers and the writing of the nation's Constitution, and that a class structure of great and stubborn inequalities does not exist. A grim but joyous few see portents of a world that is living out the last days. So this is, I would suggest, the situation in which we find ourselves. The structures have changed, and with them, the language, the words, the metaphors, everything we would use to try and talk about our world, there's this enormous disjuncture between the words that we use and the reality that we experience. And this makes us crazy. This makes us crazy. When the words you use don't actually address reality, you have a problem, a major problem. You can no longer speak meaningfully with others. You can no longer create meaningful civic activities that would inform governance or influence governments. This is removed. It can no longer exist. The signs and symbols, the structure of language itself, it's all changed. And we see this in a variety of interesting ways in our world. We see it in, how we talk or don't talk about policies. You ever notice that wars just sort of get announced? Sort of like the weather? There are never actual real discussions anymore. There's some vague document somewhere, some authorization for use of military force, or this undeclared war against terror, which was really the last war we ever needed to put on paper, because that will cover all wars for the rest of time. But we don't talk about the policies. We don't talk about the policies of war. We don't talk about the policies of taxes, the policies of spending, the policies of trade. We have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was just negotiated in secret. And it was so important to get the vote in Congress to just be a straight up or down vote. No chance to amend anything. Either approve it or don't approve it. Well, we know that the oligarchs and the corporations want it approved, so it will certainly be approved. And this will continue to undermine the economy and the economic structure of the U.S., which, of course, no one will make the connection, just as they never make the connection to NAFTA, just as they never make the connection to the other trade agreements that have stripped the industry out of the U.S. and sold it off overseas, all in the name of free markets. But think, what would we have to talk about if we talked about these things? If we were to talk about, say, taxes. What would we have to say about it? Well, we might have to look at things like little town in that was in the news a while ago of Ferguson, Missouri. When you look at what's taking place in these little towns, when you dive into the social situations that actually led to Darren Wilson being stopped. What was the reason he was initially stopped? He was walking in the street. And in Ferguson, this is an illegal act to walk in the street. Now, strangely enough, some 95% of these dastardly perpetrators of this monstrous crime in Ferguson were African American. And what that means is that, as Mojo puts it, walking while black is not a punchline, it's a crime. And so it's a crime then that comes with fines that are strictly enforced. This is where it gets interesting. This is where we get to taxes. Ferguson's police force in 2014 issued 16,000 arrest warrants to, are you ready for this? 3/4 of the town's population of 21,000. 75% of all the residents had active arrest warrants. Now, how did this come to be? It came to be because the geniuses of governance in Missouri don't have a tax base for little towns like Ferguson or Pagedale, another little suburb of St. Louis. So what do? They issue lunatic citations for the craziest stuff. I mean, just crazy. In Pagedale, for instance, and I'm citing here an article from Mother Jones. It's from their Out Front section, the September-October edition. No author. Okay, Pagedale. You can't have a hedge more than 3 feet high. You can't have a basketball hoop or a wading pool in front of your house. You can't have a dish antenna on the front of your house. You can't walk on the roadway if there is a sidewalk, and if not a sidewalk, they must walk on the left side of the roadway. They must walk on the right of the crosswalk. You can't conduct a barbecue in your front yard and can't have an alcoholic beverage within 150 feet of a barbecue. Kids can't play in the street. They have restrictions against pants being worn below the waist. You have to park your car within 500 feet of a lamp or source of illumination. Blinds must be neatly hung in a respectable appearance, properly maintained, and in a good state of repair. Well, that all happened in 2010 when Missouri passed a law that capped the amount of money cops could collect from traffic stops. Whoops. All right, so there goes one source of revenue. So the other side is you just start making other kinds of offenses. Okay, we're not doing traffic stops. We're doing code offenses. Code offenses now become a way to raise consistently the revenue required for small towns like Frontenac and Pagedale and Ferguson. So Pagedale, for instance, saw a 495% increase in non-related traffic arrests. And we see this all over the country. We see it in South Carolina, where they have Operation Rolling Thunder once a year, where they get 21 different law enforcement agencies to come down on I-85 and I-26 because they're going to stop drug dealers. They're going to catch drug traffickers. Well, in 2013, they netted 1,300 traffic citations and 300 speeding tickets, and they got exactly one felony conviction. So you issue tickets, people can't pay them, so you up the fine on the tickets, and they can't pay that either. So then you're left with the position of putting them in jail, which makes no sense whatsoever because it costs more money to put them in jail. So this is what happens when you don't have a tax structure, when you don't actually have a tax system that works, because we don't want no damn taxes. Well, the money's going to come from somewhere. It always does. And in this case, it comes from the poorest of the poor. Not from the middle class, not from the corporations, not from Walmart or any of the big box stores. It comes from bleeding the poor. So that's a conversation we could reasonably have about war and taxes and spending and trade and this kinds of thing. That's a conversation we could reasonably have, is how may states and cities fund their infrastructures. That would be interesting. But it's not going to happen because it violates the ideology of no taxation. So we just won't call it a tax. We'll call it a fine. Now, if you live in this, you immediately have a sense of Kafkaesque reality, that the law is only for you, even though you have no real rights under the law around these situations. But the law is only for you. It's going to make sure you do what is required for you. And this looks insane. It makes people crazy. And if they talk about it the way it appears to them, if they talk about the way their experiences appear to them as they live them, it looks like they're being charged for being black while walking, or walking while black. It looks like there's a war on black people to them. It is unmistakable. And once you have that idea in your head, you know you are seriously outside of the social order. Right? Seriously outside of the social order. So just as we don't talk about policies, we don't talk about, various kinds of activities that the government should be engaged in, at least not in meaningful ways. And these would be things like, well, let's throw in war again, because it's also an activity that we engage in. Healthcare, education, infrastructure. Where are the plans? Where do people talk about this? And when they do talk about it, they almost never include how they're going to fund it, because taxes are the third rail, thanks to the Republican religion of no taxes. Collapse everything down, which is ultimately just a plan to sell it all off, to sell off the entire infrastructure and indeed the government to the oligarchs, to remove the middleman, so to speak, right, which would be government. Well, think about this for a minute. Let's think about the war on terror, the terror war. This is one of our great current fascinations, and we trundle about the world pretending we have some sort of plan for this, right? Okay. So, but when we look at it, when we break it down, this plan makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. Saker, from Vineyard of the Saker, writes, I believe there's been a major diplomatic feat for the U.S., and yet another Russian diplomatic victory. Here are some points which have been agreed upon, Iran will participate in negotiations about the future of Syria. Syria will not be allowed to break up. Syria will not be ruled by a religious regime. The Syrian military will not be disbanded. Daesh, ISIS, and other terrorists will be defeated, and the Syrian people will get to choose their leader. Right? So this was an agreement that the Russians worked out with the major players there, including Iran, and the U.S. did not want Iran involved in this. Right? So the U.S. has been trying to isolate Iran, partly at the behest of Israel, but there's no way you're going to solve this problem in Syria and this problem of Daesh without Iran. And everybody gets that now. The U.S. is not going to be able to split Syria into Wahhabi and Alawite. None of the factions supported by the U.S., which are currently all religious extremist factions, are going to be allowed to rule. The Syrian military, which is solidly pro-Assad, quoting Saker, will not be disbanded or disarmed. All the factions supported by the U.S., all being Wahhabi extremists, must be militarily defeated. Assad will be allowed to remain in power since he's by far their most popular leader. And this is the reality on the ground following this recent set of discussions. So let's compare this, as Saker does, to what the U.S. policies and goals stated are, and then what is official policy on Syria. Okay, policy and goal, full military support for ISIS. Right? That's the actions of the U.S., full military support for ISIS. We've been pouring money and weapons into them through their subsidiaries from the get-go. But the official policy is categorical opposition to ISIS. Right? The U.S. actions promote a Wahhabi regime in Syria. Remove the Alawites, remove Assad, remove the Shia, and let the Wahhabi have it. Well, the official U.S. position is to promote a secular regime. It seems unlikely. The U.S. action is to break up Syria, but the official U.S. policy is to maintain a unitary Syria. The U.S. actions have focused on the destruction of the Syrian military through the proxy armies of Daesh and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and the whole bunch of them. But the official U.S. policy is that the Syrians get to have an open and free election. U.S. actions have been to sabotage all the Russian efforts to defeat these Wahhabi, but the official U.S. policy is collaboration with Russia. U.S. action is regime change not just in Syria, but also in Iran. But the official policy is Iran is our partner in this. These don't make sense. When you put these side by side, they are mutually contradictory. So it's not a surprise that people are confused by this, because you have the reality, which despite the best efforts of our news moguls, still manages to seep out in small dribs and drabs. So we do see some of the things that just can't be hidden or disguised away, but they don't mesh with what the people say is happening, or what they say they're doing, or what they say they're going to do. So on this domestic level and on this international level, there are these enormous disjunctions, these enormous breaks between perception and reality. And with each of these, the world becomes a little more Kafkaesque. And I reassert that it doesn't matter who you vote for in the national election. It will not change these conditions. This is not being run by a person. This is not the sort of thing a president could step up and just fix. This is a deep bureaucratic structure. And it manifests itself, as Woolen pointed out, in a variety of interesting ways. This inverted totalitarianism that he wrote that we have here exploits the poor, reduces or weakens health programs and social services. It regiments mass education for an insecure workforce threatened by the importation of low-wage workers. Woolen said, quote, employment in a high-tech, volatile, and globalized economy is normally as precarious as during an old-fashioned depression. The result is that citizenship, or what remains of it, is practiced amidst a continuing state of worry. Hobbes had it right. When citizens are insecure and at the same time driven by competitive aspirations, they yearn for political stability rather than civic engagement, protection rather than political involvement. And this is exactly the state we see today. We see the fractioning of the body politic, the fracturing of the social world. And it's all around us, yet the words that we continue to speak, we're a democracy, you are free, don't fit the reality that people live every day. They just don't. So if we were to consider, for instance, another domain where we could see aspects of this, we could talk about the U.S. economy, could we not? I hear you nodding your heads. Yes, we could. Okay, well, let's do that. Let's talk about the U.S. economy. Paul Craig Roberts, a former official in the Treasury of Ronald Reagan, and a Washington resident, I understand, points out that he declared in 2004, on January 6th, that the consequence of jobs offshoring would be that the U.S. would be a third world country in 20 years. And he writes, this was on the 31st of October, you can find it at the UNS Review. He writes, that was 11 years ago, and the U.S. is on course to descend to third world status before the remaining 9 years of my prediction have expired. The evidence is everywhere. So he gives a bunch of Bureau of Census evidence about how real declines in household income have been falling ever since. Right? The bottom quintile, the lower 20%, has had a 17.1% decline in real income from 1999. So they've gone in real numbers from $14,092 a year to $11,676. Well, that's a couple $1,000s right there, and at those sorts of numbers, that's a lot. And he cites some of the other quintiles, but here, let me just give you the takeaway, because numbers get boring on the radio, and they're hard to follow. I get that. Only the top 1% or less, mainly the 0.1%, has experienced growth in income and wealth since 1999. Right? And these are Census Bureau things, right? He points out that the Census Bureau is rigged to understate things, the way they report things. It's rigged to make them look less bad. Quoting now, if more accurate measures of inflation are used, the declines in real household income are larger and have been declining for a longer period. Some measures show real median annual household income below the levels of the late 1960s and early 70s. Note, he writes, that these declines have occurred during an alleged 6-year economic recovery from 2009 to the present, and during a period when the labor force was shrinking due to a sustained decline in labor force participation. On April 3rd, 2015, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics announced that 93,175,000 Americans of working wage are not in the workforce, a historical record. Because normally, an economic recovery is marked by a rise in the labor force participation rate. That would make sense, yeah. Okay. John Williams reports that when discouraged workers are included among the measured of the unemployed, the U.S. employment rate is currently 23% and not the 5.2% reported figure. But again, that is saying the emperor has no clothes. And it wouldn't matter if it were Obama or a Republican or somebody else. These numbers have been tweaked for a while. So the current unemployment rate, the real unemployment rate, is around 23%. That's a Great Depression level. That's approaching a quarter of the workforce. But it gets worse. In 2014, 38% of all American workers made less than $20,000. 38% made less than $20,000. 51% made less than $30,000. Here's the killer number, though. 72% of all American workers in 2014 made less than $50,000. That's almost three-fourths made less than $50,000. Well, what can they buy? That's not a lot of money. A cheap secondhand car, maybe if two people are bringing home that much money, you could get into a house somewhere. But what we've done is to create jobs. These much ballyhooed jobs are not real jobs. Most of them are lowly paid part-time jobs, waitresses, bartenders, retail clerks, ambulatory healthcare services. Meanwhile, the number of real jobs, Roberts points out, the number of real jobs with benefits continues to shrink as a percentage of total jobs. Here's a shocker. Nearly half of 25-year-olds lived with their parents in 2012-2013. Nearly half. That's almost double the number in 1999. When half of 25-year-olds cannot form households, the market for housings and home furnishings collapses. Finance is the only sector of the U.S. economy that is growing. And why? Because we live on debt. And debt is a very useful kind of control on people. So, back to Roberts, the absence of growth in real consumer income means there is no growth in aggregate demand to drive the economy. Consumer indebtedness limits the ability of consumers to expand their spending with credit. And it gets worse. Because when we get rid of our manufacturing jobs, as he points out, research, development, design, and innovation also tend to go away. What are you inventing for whom? What are you researching for whom? For your own company? No, we outsource that one. And as he points out, the entire economy is lost. We see the social infrastructure collapsing, the economic infrastructure collapsing, the family itself collapsing, the rule of law, the accountability of government. These are all his words. And we have college graduates who can't find employment because their jobs have been offshored or given to foreigners on work visas or just don't exist anymore. So they come out deeply in debt and then come to the shocking discovery that they can't get employment that'll even service their student debts. And so they have made a very bad economic decision. And these debts cannot be made to go away. We see the same kind of processes, he points out, taking place in other sectors, colleges and universities. He writes, where administrations spend 75% of the university's budget on themselves, hiring adjuncts to teach classes for a few $1,000s. I know a lot of adjuncts. It is true. It is a hideously exploitative system. The demand for full-time faculty with a career has collapsed in most fields, many fields. And he writes, when the consequences of putting short-term corporate profits before American jobs fully hit, the demand for university education will collapse, and with it, American science and technology. His concluding statement is worth reading, so I'll read it. It is a reasonable conclusion that a social, political, economic system so incompetently run is already a third world country. But we don't need Paul Craig Roberts to tell us this. We can look out our window. Right? We can just look outside at collapsing streets, at bridges, at hospitals, where they have to reduce the number of beds in the psychiatric ward at Sacred Heart because they can't afford to hire enough doctors to do it. Why don't they have this money? So the answer is just reduce the services. We see it in education. We see it across the board. And yet, we still keep this fantastic ancient idea of the American dream going. Work hard, save your money, be frugal, you'll get ahead. That's simply not true for enormous segments of this population. But it's certainly very true for a small segment of the uber rich. And I'll say again, who you vote for Senate or Congress won't change this a bit. Not a bit. Congress is already owned. The presidency is already owned. Yes, Bernie, I know, and blah, blah, blah. But for Bernie Sanders to make serious changes, he would have to have enormous support from the legislature and the courts, which he will not get. He will not get. There's no possibility of this, in my opinion. So, again, this Kafkaesque disconnect of language and lived experience, language and reality. And a part of this we can lay at the door. We can lay the blame for a chunk of this at the door of the media, especially the news, who work with other powers to deliberately introduce divisive ideas and discussions, things that drive people apart, rather than allowing people to have conversations about a commonality or working together. So we're back to this idea of we have no language to create a community again. We have no language that we can speak so that we can actually create a social world. And it's easy to keep fracturing it with this kind of racist, classist, false political polemic that we see again and again and again. Why am I not talking about the national election? Because I don't want to report on propaganda and polemic. It's that simple. It's boring. It's predictable. And everybody and their dog points at it and goes, oh, look at this. Isn't it horrible? On the left, on the right, the clickbait is there for everybody. Everybody gets their favorite flavor of clickbait around these issues, and we rush off down those divisive, damaging, language-destroying, reality-eroding paths. And we have nothing to say one to another. It's important to remember the main thing that TV has to do is to put butts on seats. To put butts on seats. To put people in front of the screen so they can sell the eyeballs to advertisers. And to ensure that they get people with eyeballs they can sell to advertisers, they engage in various kinds of theater which will draw an audience to the predictable sorts of polemics and drama that they've come to expect. Again, there is no social language possible that can emerge out of that. It's like the people in Plato's cave talking about the shadows on the wall and speculating on them and philosophizing about them. There's nothing meaningful to say about the shadows except that they exist. And where are the other words? Where is the language we would use to collectively build a social? When even knowledge, real knowledge, self-reflexive thought informed by a lot of reading and meeting with other ideas, when knowledge and experience of the world are themselves primary suspects of what? Subversion, being an outsider, being a troublemaker, I don't know. Something. When knowledge and experience themselves are suspect, then fools rush into the vacuum and palaver and blather and bluster and bloviate, and this fills the gap. And people nod their heads or hold their stomachs, blow their noses, and open another beer. We pretend that it's all still working. We pretend the language, the signs, and the symbols, and all of that's still taking place. But it's not. It's just the way we pretend to be a superpower with these mega aircraft carriers we use to intimidate the world, which are of remarkably little use from all of the wars we've been involved in. But in truth, we're a third world country, and we're collapsing daily farther and farther down this hole. More and more of the real wealth of this economy is being shipped overseas or funneled up through this inverted totalitarian structure to the oligarchs on the top. And I understand David Koch is trying to soften his image. Good luck with that, David, because image is everything in this world. Image is everything. So there is this disjuncture between idea and experience, between language and experience. We're a superpower, but we're a third world country. We have more freedom than anybody, but we're a police state and rapidly becoming even more of a police state. We have disjunctures in stories about our activities in the world, and the many domains of our experience do not find voice in the languages available to us. They just don't find voice there at all. And in fact, back to Wolin again. Cultural wars, he writes, might seem an indication of strong political involvement. Actually, they are a substitute. The notoriety they receive from the media and from politicians eager to take firm stands on non-substantive issues serves to distract attention and contribute to cant politics of the inconsequential. Cant politics of the inconsequential. And indeed they do. He continues, the ruling groups can now operate on the assumption that they don't need the traditional notion of something called a public in the broad sense of a coherent whole. They now have the tools to deal with the very disparities and differences that they have themselves helped create. It's a game in which you manage to undermine the cohesiveness that the public requires if they are to be politically effective. And at the same time, you create these different, distinct groups that inevitably find themselves in tensions or at odds or in competition with other groups, so that it becomes more of a melee than it does a way of fashioning majorities. The United States has become the showcase of how democracy can be managed without appearing to be suppressed, says Sheldon Wolin. And what is, again, our experience of that? What do we feel? What do we think? What do we taste? What do we smell in our world? Nothing good. We get by with a little less each day, a little less reality, a little less of a social world. We still keep playing the old forms. Let's get 40 people together and march and protest and stop at all the stoplights, and we'll all feel good and everybody goes home. Changes nothing. Local elections are a little different. You can actually tweak a few things on the local level sometimes. But the national election, at this stage, it doesn't matter. And this is why I will not speak of the clown show, the distraction, except in general. So I said I had two poems I was thinking about today. I do. And the other poem I'll read in just a moment. It's by Vachel Lindsay, one of the great poets of early 20th century Illinois, who fell out of disfavor over a couple of his poems that, he being a man of his time, they were somewhat racist. But this is not one of them. And he was quite a good socialist in a lot of ways. And a very keen observer of society and inequities. The man actually wrote a series of poems he published in a book later, where he wandered around the Illinois countryside from farm to farm, exchanging rhymes for bread. And the book is called Rhymes to be Exchanged for Bread. But this is his poem, The Leaden-Eyed. Let not young souls be smothered out before they do quaint deeds and fully flaunt their pride. It is the world's one crime. Its babes grow dull. Its poor are ox-like, limp, and leaden-eyed. Not that they starve, but starve so dreamlessly. Not that they sow, but that they seldom reap. Not that they serve, but have no gods to serve. Not that they die, but that they die like sheep. And that brings me pretty much to the end of today's show. I've got a couple of announcements I would like to make, so don't go away. First of all, I want to remind everybody out there you can donate your car or truck to KYRS. Just call 855-KYRS-CAR, 855-597-7227, We'll arrange a free pickup. You'll get a nice tax credit, and we'll get some money, which helps to keep us on the air. And the other thing I would remind all of our listeners of is this is the weekend of the KYRS 12th anniversary party and silent auction. November 7th, Saturday, 7 p.m. at the Cracker Company Building, 304 West Pacific, downtown Spokane. We've got auction items including ski passes, concert tickets, gift certificates. We got live music by the Bobby Patterson Band, used to be the Fat Tones, drinks and appetizers available. Kids under 16 are free. Bring them all. I love watching kids dance. It's always a trip. You can get your tickets. You can go to kyrs.org and get your tickets there, or you can call 747-3012. The event is sponsored by Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington and North Idaho, and it will be the party of the year, I assure you. And you can meet your favorite DJs. So that's the KYRS 12th Anniversary Party and Silent Auction, November 7th, 7 p.m., the Cracker Company Building. And next week, I'm going to have a guest, Peter Shields, who is well-versed in and has studied for some while the ideas of boundaries, borders, and the politics of this in the international arena. Will be here for the Memorial Day show. It seems altogether fitting to have him here. So that is a show you will not want to miss. You can reach Long Waves Radio and me. Longwaves at kyrs.org for email. Find me on Facebook, Longwaves Radio, 3 words. And I think I've finally squared away the technical problems that stopped my podcasting of old shows for a while. So I've got 2 that'll be going up on YouTube. Long Waves Radio, put it all in quotes and run a search on YouTube and you'll turn it right over. So thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with my special guest, Peter Shields. And until then, you stay smart, stay safe, stay warm, and look for ways to create a public. Until then, I'm out of here. And you've been listening to Long Waves on KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Bye-bye.